great. I'm actually going to come at things from a little bit different angle. I just tell you a little bit about myself. Yes, okay. So the title of my talk is Metadata, Ghost and Machine. The perspective that I come from is I started out from a religious family. Then from there I found that there were certain practices and ideas and ways of obtaining knowledge, etc., that where they didn't seem to conform to their own sets of rules, and so I rejected religion entirely, and went more towards completely just materialism, atheism, etc. Now, in my study of that, I then started to find that the same problems I had with religion, I then also had with science, where there was a lack of conforming to the rules which they said that they were conforming to. And so in studying that, then I ended up coming back to kind of a spirituality that, and so my path, I feel, is to try to provide a way for those, the more materialist type of people to come more into the spirituality and see a way of conceiving of spirituality that I think that those who are more spiritual could also agree with, but perhaps in a different set of terms. So part of the problem is that I wanted to talk about a lot of different things. Let's see if I can figure out how to make this work here. There we go. Okay, so there was a variety of things that happened. I actually have developed a full model that deals with a variety of topics. And actually, what I found is that there is a rational, deterministic, purely deterministic way that can actually also describe spirituality. And that sounds like an oxymoron, I suppose. But I don't have time to present a lot of that information, so I'm just going to barely kind of hint at it and show you, just a couple of slides as a tease. And wow, apparently the formatting is completely lost on this. So. Okay. Well, anyway, there's things such as ancient physics that you can find scraps of knowledge that have been passed down to us through the ages, where everything from the various teachings of cultures and religions, and the Akasha and Prana. So I'm not going to be able to touch on a lot of that, and unfortunately, I can't see my notes here. So if you'll just bear with me for a moment. So anyway, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the crucial importance of metadata. Now, metadata means about, and of course, here this is kind of a metaphysics conference, which is about physics. Now, in the past, people have tried to use that as a pejorative, whereas, of course, meta simply means about. It's the language about something. It is a higher order language to describe another. There's a subject and an object language. So, one of the other things that I would like to discuss is that we actually need to, I think, push the scientific community towards a different format, which will include the meta portion of any theory and have that as kind of a binary approach to hard science. So let me get to the next slide here. All right, so we have to have a clarity of connection between every aspect of the model and what precisely is being modeled in the real world. It's an acceptance and clear delineation between the copy and the original, and therefore it is a conscious recognition of the inherent error introduced by this relationship between our copy and what it is that we are copying when we have a model. So when we deny the fallibility of axioms, we increase the error of our projections and descriptions. The model is not only what is directly described, but it's also a core representation of all the ways in which it may be used and all that it infers by extension. So whenever we're creating a model of physics, it is not just simply the core, it is also what it can be extended to. So then I wanted to talk a little bit about Gödel and Tarski. Now, Gödel and Tarski, I'm going to try to sum it up a little bit more because I don't really have nearly enough time. You have to excuse my pressure of speech because I wanted to really get in a lot of things here, but 15 minutes is not quite enough. So so Tarski, he basically they had a discussion of mathematics in which they were showing that there is something fundamentally missing. There was Tarski's undefinability theorem, which was kind of an extension of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So informally, the logic of the theorem says that given some formal arithmetic, the concept of truth in that arithmetic is not definable using the expressive means that the arithmetic affords. It must rely upon a meta-language with an expressive power which is exceeding the object language. So I would take this idea of Tarski and then further apply it more to the relationship between inductive and deductive reasoning, such that each plays the role of both meta-language and object language in a mutual dependency. So one of the most easily drawn upon examples of the failure that both Gödel and Tarski used, it boils down to simply feeding self-reference and mutual exclusivity into the machinery of a pure logic system. And then it breaks itself. There's a great book, Gödel, Escher, and Bach, that's one of my favorites that I'm kind of referring to a little bit here. So there is, all of us are aware of there's a difference between human intellect and computer intellect. We can look at a computer, we can see that it can do calculations far faster or more precisely than a human being can. However, we do not find it to be an intellect that is superior to our own. And so therefore, anyone can identify that there is obviously something else to intellect that is beyond that ability to calculate. So whenever we have this idea of shut up and calculate in physics, basically what we're doing is we're removing the difference between computer intellect and that greater human intellect that we all know of. So now, one of the things that you'll find is that it's interesting is you can actually have a spectrum in which you trade off different abilities. And one of the things that they found from autism to Asperger's is it's basically kind of a hyper-masculinization of the mind, in which you can see how the savantism role goes in there, because they're capable of more in one direction as they lose something in another direction. I think all of us are somewhere along a spectrum that is kind of like that we give up certain things to gain others, and it's a kind of a breadth and width type of situation. I want to try to explain a little bit here. So the point is that logic can be simultaneously valid and untrue. So that is the key here, is valid but also untrue. The cause of that contradiction is an improper metadata mapping between the model and that which is modeled. So say for instance you give a child the idea of what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object. And immediately what they'll do is they'll try to continue forward from the axioms. What they're doing is they're relying upon the axioms, and they end up in a loop, which is they believe that the axioms are absolutely true. And that is because logic breaks because it relies upon the axioms. And the axioms themselves come from somewhere, and they come from something greater. Then let me give you another example that's going to kind of be a little bit offbeat, but I think it can tie together. So there's a group of natives that what they do is they beat a root into water. They say a little prayer, etc., and then the fish rise to the surface. So for them, it is the spirit of the root fishing for them. Now this is basically kind of replicatable science, that the spirit of the root is fishing for them. But the issue is we can then test that and find that it's actually a neurotoxin that is not harmful to human beings, but is harmful to fish, and that's what's actually going on. So their model is predictive and therefore useful. However, because it is not assembled correctly, it is not extensible. You cannot extend it properly. They cannot take that root and have it do other things for them as we could with a better model. So there's this interpretation that defines a general direction for the extension of a theory. And I believe that what we have is, in physics, we try to disconnect those two, and they're inextricable. You cannot disconnect those two concepts. Let's see. Yes, okay. If I can go to the next one here, come on. Oh, it's not going to cooperate with me. I'm going to skip that slide. All right. So let's try to define the difference between knowledge and understanding. And I think that it lies in metadata, or the relationship mapping between large groups of already associated data. It's defining the relationships between sets and sets of sets. So it's a fractal mapping. The size of the total data included in the map and the number of layers involved is a measure of the level of understanding that can be gained by that map. So the map is stored in just in its stored form is no more than knowledge once again. So perhaps understanding should instead be defined as the active process of a search being carried out across that map for the purpose of verifying and extending it. So throughout nature, from evolutionary development of various species to the processes of the human mind, there is a cycle of growth and pruning, which are interdependent as a refining base and an exploratory extension. The cycle of life starts at a generalization of past adaptation. Then you have the environmental exploration for the purpose of specialization. And of course, that specialization is a type of adaptation. But then, by specializations, you have built-in obsolescence because of the ever-changing world. And in that changing environment, then you have to have death alongside the regeneralization that comes at a new birth. And that, of course, is then based upon past specialization. So you have this breadth and depth cycle that's going back and forth. And I believe that what I'm trying to put forward is that in modern science and the way in which we do things, they're trying to only pick one side of something that is a dualism. So just as there is knowledge and understanding, there's a basis and exploration with the pruning and growth. So let me then talk about something called a tangled hierarchy that I actually did that wording from Douglas Hofstadter. And the idea is that there are, just like we talked about the fact that something has to have a meta language, which is greater than the object language to be able to represent truth. There has to be something outside of it to describe it. So that is seen as a superior, where in a tangled hierarchy, both individuals seem superior to the other. So say, for instance, if I take a taxi cab and I have both the driver and the passenger, and then I ask you which one is controlling the vehicle, well, you might pick the overt path and say it's the person, on the steering wheel who's moving the levers, and he's in the front seat, so he must be controlling it. However, the person in the back seat is actually who decided where the destination is. So therefore, you have kind of a tangled hierarchy from where each point you can see that the other is more in control in one way or another. And I think this is, once again, kind of that complementary feedback loop between subtle processes and the overt, and each is superior in some way. So with a reliance upon axioms, we rely upon an error-prone process, which gives that axiom basis. So the error-prone process I'm talking about is induction. So you have inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, and deductive reasoning cannot actually occur without the inductive process, without that meta language, which is greater than the object language. So therefore, the appearance of immutable truth is an alluring illusion, and only acceptance of the necessity of error that happens during the exploratory phase can knowledge ever really develop. And an acknowledgement of that doubt is kind of the key to us finding what we term as truth. So understanding this therefore must be conceived as a process, like the process of life itself, instead of as a state. It's the action and motive force acting upon the substrate of knowledge. So inductive and deductive reasoning play the roles of yin and yang respectively as a mutual dependency, and that is represented as linear and concurrency in my model. And like I said, unfortunately, this is also a physics model. But I'm having to talk about is just the way, I'm talking about the connective tissue. What I'm trying to give you right now is the way in which my model works instead of the details of it. And that's kind of a metadata map of what it is that I want to communicate to you. So one must understand that the yang substrate of an engine is cold and dead without the yin motive force of the fuel flowing through it. And that is the same as mathematics and your theory, which connects all of the ideas that you've put together to try to communicate the mathematics. Like, for instance, whenever you have a child who is given a word problem, they may set up a math problem and solve it correctly, and then they'll take that problem to you and insist that they have done it correctly. However, they can also solve that word problem incorrectly because they did not properly map the concepts to basically that object language. There's a disconnect, and this happens in physics where they're doing the maths without properly connecting them because they want to ignore that subtle back seat. They want to ignore that part of it as if it's not there. When it's not only there, they're absolutely reliant upon it. All right, so I'm gonna have to try to speed up a little bit here. I'm almost done. All right, so with the proper balance between the cycle, the fuel's motive force and the guidance of the engine is upset. Fuel destroys the engine, or the engine itself would just simply die with it and be incapable of continuing the cycle. So those minor imbalances eventually lead to damaged structure, which then must be replaced. And this is the necessity of revolution. And the current revolution that is actually going on in physics right now, there is a kind of a deterministic fluid dynamics revolution that is kind of going on behind the scenes in physics right now that I would love to bring out at some point. But it's actually it's a necessary part of the process that Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions brought out, and so that hopefully we can start to move toward gaining some acceptance in physics that there is something missing. And I guess I'm going to try to end it there because, let me actually put one more thing up on the screen here. So the one last thing I want to talk about was the idea of multi-layered data. Let me get back to that in just a moment. That is not cooperating with me at all. Okay, let me show this image real quick. One of the things that you can have is when someone is looking at a person playing a computer game on a computer. If you could take a scientific view of this, where they cannot see the monitor, and say, for instance, they've never actually experienced a game before, they don't know what it is. What they'll see is drives whirring, electronic signals moving around, and they'll say that this is all that is happening at that location. However, a person who's actually capable of looking at the monitor, which has used a vast amount of context to interpret the data, they see an entire world, and they are experiencing a world. So there are two things happening at the same time. And hopefully, the way in which this image was revealed, you first just noticed the dragons, and then the face came up. And that is kind of a pause between your linear and concurrent processing. And I think that that understanding that all data is intrinsically multi-layered in this fashion is also part of the process. So hopefully I didn't get too broad there. Thanks a lot, guys.
A couple minutes for questions. Give an announcement.
I've got an announcement. First of all, I think we should give these two excellent speakers more than a couple of minutes, and we should give them until coffee time, which is 10:45. So I notice that we have time, Cynthia. We actually do.
We're going to go past 1 o'clock.
If necessary, we will. But there is so much going on here that we need.
All right. Well, in that case, well, let me just talk a little bit about the idea of. Okay, so let me go back to physics. Now, for the physics portion of it, where I'm going with that is that I started to find that a lot of the beliefs in modern physics actually are what I tend to fight fire with fire. And so whereas I see them calling what I think to be an integral process wooish, because of their lack of respect for the necessity of that search of breadth that happens in spirituality, I then take that same type of perspective and say, no, I think that what you're doing is foolish. And so one of the things that I've been doing is finding the points of failure at which they have to rely upon inductive reasoning, and through their denial of their reliance upon it, they have revealed an opening and a weakness in the supposed system that they conform to. Now, the thing is, I actually do believe in a completely deterministic universe. And like I said, this seems like a complete oxymoron. Like, how could I simultaneously believe in spirituality while also believing in determinism? Well, first off, that means I also believe in destiny, and that also means that I believe in a complexity that is close enough to random that it is indistinguishable to minds such as ours. There's not really a distinguishment between pseudo-random and random that is necessary for us. So there are some things going on in that you can go all the way back to 19th century physics, and kind of that's what's going on in this revolution I'm talking about. And I actually met one of the people who's writing the papers from Cambridge. He came to visit. He did a lecture here at the School of Law about some security issues.
Any questions?
I have a question for Shiva. As you flew through your slides, I saw something that said, "This is the title of my book."
Yes. Well, there's actually two books. One is the neoclassical interpretation of modern physics, which is basically bringing out these different researchers. Like there's a researcher at MIT who does quantum hydrodynamic analogs, and taking all of those ideas, how they're connected through history, and I'm trying to bring that out. And my second book is actually The Rock and the River, and the idea is this interplay between this kind of like a tangled hierarchy, which is that the rock moves the river and the river moves the rock, is something I say very frequently. And understanding that this tangled hierarchy is a basic principle of nature, all throughout nature, and it is a basic principle of cognition as well. So,
And most of those are out now. Thank you.
Then,
Are they out now?
Hold on.
no, they're not yet out. No, I'm still
Not yet.
working.
Yeah.
You want to say something on this?
Yeah, I would say I think that I kind of view our entire reality as a dream of
Yeah.
that universal one, the universe, whatever it is, and basically a self-reflection, because that's part of the fractal nature of reality. Is whenever you self-reflect, you have an infinite loop and a fractal that builds from that. And so, so I think that we actually are a dream, and that. And that's part of the whole separation, the experience, all of that is part of this large dream of something that is greater than these small things that we perceive ourselves as, but instead as that greater thing, which is our truer self, which has multiple layers.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to just add something to that.
Yeah.
Is the whole idea of the universal consciousness, because I think it's that kind of relationship.
Okay, let's give a hand.
Real quick demonstration, I'll take a moment. Basically, it's just the idea of metadata, the proper assembly of data. What I have here are 6 stencils. And these 6 stencils, okay. Oh, thank you. Okay, so these 6 stencils pretty much look meaningless at the outset. There's really not a whole lot to them. And however, once you try to find a pattern in them, one of the things that you'll find is if you were to spray each one of them onto a card, like individually, you'd get just nonsense. There's nothing really there. However, if you were to then take the last 2, for instance, or actually just 2 of the last 4 anyway, and put them on the card, well then you would get this, which is pain. However, the problem is that you've not properly assembled them, because if I then use 2 of them together at the same time, what I can instead get out of this set of data here, just by assembling them properly and using them properly, is instead this. And so it's all this is an example of multi-layered data, and how it is that through interpretation we can get different messages from the exact same data. That's it.
Thank you very much.